Welcome to APUSH for All, Review Edition. Today's episode is part one of our four-part series designed to help you prep for the AP US History exam. The next 15 minutes or so, we'll walk through the most essential themes, turning points, and ideas from 1491 to 1800 that includes colonization, resistance, revolution, and the founding of a new government.
Our goal, big picture clarity. No tangents, no trivia, just the core content and thinking skills that will help you crush the exam. So let's lay out today's major themes. First, interactions among cultures, Europeans, Native Americans, and Africans. Second, conflict and cooperation in the colonies. Third, the causes and consequences of revolution. And finally, the building of a new constitutional government. Let's get into it.
Okay, so let's rewind to 1491. North America wasn't an untouched wilderness like Europeans thought. It was a complex world of diverse native societies. The Mississippians, the Pueblo, the Iroquois Confederacy all had distinct political and social structures. They had trade networks, they had very sophisticated agriculture, and diplomacy existed long before Europeans arrived. But in 1492, everything changed. The Columbian Exchange brought horses, disease, and wheat to the Americas, and potatoes, maize, and gold back to Europe. Diseases like smallpox decimated indigenous populations, leading to dramatic demographic shifts.
In 1519, Cortez sailed to Mexico with 500 men. By 1521, he had toppled the Aztec Empire. The Spanish crown rejoiced, but indigenous civilizations were devastated. That was from Bernal Diaz del Castillo in The Conquest of New Spain. This era is all about exchange and exploitation. Gold, God, and glory, not necessarily in that order, that was driving European conquest. Spanish encomienda labor systems and French fur trading coexisted with British settler colonialism. Different approaches, same result, pressure on native lands and lives.
It's also important, I just got signed out of my Google account. Okay, I'm back. No tangents, remember guys? Here we are. Okay. It's okay, we can laugh, you guys. I feel like we're a little stuffy because we're in a different studio.
Okay, we should note that this is not normal conditions for us.
Right.
That's
because
right.
We're out of the studio that we normally record in. We're in a bigger space. And we can actually, I don't know if this is affecting you guys a little bit, I'm hearing my voice back to me.
Yes.
I'm feeling a little self-conscious.
Yeah, and I just think that we know we're also on a time crunch because we want these to be shorter episodes, and we feel like we said no tangents, which is not easy for us. So.
And ironically, we're actually killing time that
we're on a tangent right now.
I know.
But I just want to, if you guys are lacking in confidence, you should not be, because you're both gorgeous people.
Oh my God.
Thanks, Mr. Hill.
I'm just saying. Yeah.
That means a lot coming from a guy with the best hair I've probably ever seen.
Thanks. Wasn't even fishing for that, but thanks.
Okay. It's also important to understand that we have different colonial experiences in the Americas. We've got the Spanish, the French, and the British. The Spanish focused on extracting wealth through the encomienda system that was mentioned earlier, and they tried to convert native populations to Christianity, and they created a very rigid class structure that included a mix of Europeans, Native Americans, and Africans. The French, on the other hand, they really prioritized trade, and specifically the fur trade. And they had pretty cooperative relationships with native groups and a lot fewer settlers. New France was not dedicated to building a huge French population, but the British took a different route entirely. They built permanent settler colonies, the first being Jamestown, with growing populations and little interest in assimilating native people. And this is important to know for your AP test, that these contrasting strategies of Europeans really shaped each region's development and also set the stage for different relationships with native nations and the environment.
Okay, so as we wrap that segment up, big picture, what, in a sentence or two, what should students remember?
Native people were sophisticated, robust, and diverse.
Okay, that's one.
I would also say that being able to distinguish between the Spanish, the French, and the English approaches to colonization, you had with the Spanish and the French, a much more top-down approach, whereas with the English, it was they were private. Joint stock companies were probably doing their own thing, and it's less about what the monarchy was dictating.
That's probably a nice little segue to segment 2 as we now focus in on the British colonies as they take shape. So by the 1600s, these British colonies had developed unique identities themselves. We, of course, when we think of New England, we think city on a hill, we think Puritans, we think town halls. What else should we remember about
Education.
this? Emphasis on education.
Because children had to learn to read the Bible because everything was
Absolutely.
built on that. And God and cod, that's how I remember New England.
Yeah.
God and cod.
Cod being fish.
Mm-hmm.
And then,
yeah, what else?
Well, I'm just saying. And then I always like to tell my students, all pilgrims were Puritans, but not all Puritans were pilgrims.
Correct.
Yes. What does that mean?
The Pilgrims were separatists. They go to Plymouth, just south of Boston, in 1620. The Puritans arrived 10 years later in what will become Boston and form the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They were not separatists, but they did want some more freedom religiously than they thought that they were being given in the Church of England.
And why do we care about town halls? Sounds kind of boring. What's the importance there?
Foundation of American represented democracy, the idea that the people have a say. The first line of our Constitution later will be, "We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility."
I'm going to have to cut you guys off there. I think everybody would like to hear.
Okay.
I think people like to hear the rest, but they could,
I like to say Puritans were like Pilgrims Light. What do you think of that?
I like
You think
that.
Okay.
Yeah, Pilgrim Light.
Okay, good.
And of course, we want to move now down just a little bit south to the Chesapeake colonies, where we have Virginia. Of course, their staple crop they will discover is tobacco. And
Yep.
we want to say over and over and over, tobacco, tobacco, tobacco.
Not cotton yet.
Not cotton yet, right? But with the discovery of that wicked weed, we now have the need for a labor system because tobacco is incredibly laborious and requires many hands, right? And so this is going to lead to indentured servitude, but also to the arrival of African slaves. And of course, what should we remember when we're thinking of the arrival of the first African slaves?
I think an important contrast that we recognize is that in 1619, the first slave ship carrying Africans arrives off the coast of Virginia, and in that very same year, you have a representative democratic body form also in the colony of Virginia, the House of Burgesses. So, even though that body was not fully democratic, it was many, wealthy white planters. I mean, it was all wealthy white planters. That's really the contrast that I think we've always seen in American history, is this desire to want to create a democracy where the voices of people are heard, but also we struggle with our past issues on race.
That's a great thematic thing that you can use on the test if you're describing any period of time to be able to connect back to. We talk about the fork in the road at 1619, what you just described, Ms. Kellner. Liberty established and liberty denied.
Right.
In the same year.
The great American paradox. Although it's important that we emphasize here that slavery was not what it would become. Initially, there was no clear line between free and slave based on race. That was something that would develop over time, and that would happen, of course, in the Chesapeake colonies. So then we get the middle colonies, like Pennsylvania, much more diverse. And in what way? When we think of diversity in Pennsylvania, what's going on there?
A lot of religious toleration. Economically, it's much more diverse than, the fishing and manufacturing in the north and the agriculture in the south. It really is a blend of the New England colonies and the Chesapeake colonies.
We've got the Quakers, right?
Yeah.
Get the Quakers.
Pennsylvania.
And then, of course, we go all the way down into the deep southern colonies, and we see almost immediately a reliance on agriculture and plantations, rice, tobacco, and in some cases even things like indigo. But for the most part, will increasingly become reliant again on slavery. Okay, we've got one important concept here we want to touch upon: mercantilism, the idea that colonies exist to enrich the mother country, in this case, England. And this is going to create a future conflict, right? This is the beginnings of this tension that exists between the colonies and England. But for much of the 17th and early 18th century, England really didn't enforce a lot of strict policies. They kind of took a back view of everything. We call this, of course, salutary neglect. Salutary neglect. Why do we emphasize this so much, Ms. Kellner?
Because this is, a time when England is really benefiting from what the colonies are doing. And so even though the colonies are not, always following mercantilism, that they're smuggling from other countries, Britain is still doing very well by and large by their colonies. And so when Britain decides to fully enforce mercantilism later, that is going to be a big issue. And I always explain to my students, salutary neglect is like your teachers on Monday morning. When you guys are all talking about your weekends, we don't necessarily want to know every detail. So you may think that you're being quiet and, that we're not overhearing what you're talking about. And so we just turn our heads and we're like, I'm not seeing it, I'm not hearing it, even though it's there. That's what the British were doing.
That is a good analogy. I do something similar, and I kind of describe the colonists as peevish teenagers, and the mother country, of course, as long as things are status quo, you keep the goods coming. I'm not really paying attention to what you're doing. Oh, look at that. That's adorable that you think you're building these little independent democratic institutions over there. That's, how funny is that? It's kind of like your analogy when your parents are like, you can't go anywhere on Friday night until you clean this room up. And the kid's like, you've never made me clean my room, but why now?
Right.
Because I said so.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we should also probably mention that England was embroiled in its own civil wars, its own wars on the European continent, and so it really didn't turn its attention much, for now at least, until the situation changes.
And inside the colonies, tensions were bubbling. Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, this is such a perfect example of showing how this is really going to be a class struggle, but it will also emphasize that it is ultimately going to be the punishments for Bacon's Rebellion will be kind of meted out along racial lines. So it showed poor whites and indentured servants were frustrated by elite control and frontier conflicts. So basically, the Tidewater elite was being protected by the governor. The peons, who were living in the Piedmont region and the sticks, demanded the same kind of protection and attention, and they simply weren't getting that. Meanwhile, enslaved Africans resisted through revolts like Stono's Rebellion in 1739.
Yeah, and don't forget, that what we were talking about earlier, the British start responding to these pieces of unrest by tightening their control. So in the 1650s, they start passing something called the Navigation Acts, which started this colonial resentment. And these laws were meant to enforce mercantilism, but colonists saw them as a threat to their own economic freedoms and liberties. That's a key here, freedoms and liberties. And over time, Britain also starts to increase its military presence, especially in port cities, which made many colonists feel like their liberties were being threatened, not protected by their government. So this slow buildup of control helped lay the groundwork for this growing resentment that would explode by the mid-1700s.
So let's fast forward now to the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763. Although the British won, victory brought even newer tensions. The Proclamation of 1763 was one of the first. It forbade colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains, land they had just fought alongside the British to win. This angered settlers and land speculators alike, fueling suspicion that the crown didn't have colonial interests at heart. They also started taxing the colonies to recoup the losses because it was a pretty expensive war.
Wars cost
it's
money.
Can you pay your fair share? And this would really end decades of salutary neglect. No taxation without representation, says James Otis in 1765.
And because of that frustration, we start to see escalation. It's not long after this that new taxes are introduced, like the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, Tea Tax, the Intolerable Acts, one after the other, and colonists respond to this by becoming more organized in their protest. Famously, you get the Sons of Liberty. From the American perspective, a bunch of freedom fighters. From the British perspective, a bunch of terrorists who help lead things like boycotts. You've got committees of correspondence that begin to actually organize the colonies across colonial lines. And then ultimately, you've got these dramatic events like the Boston Tea Party and finally the First Continental Congress, where colonial leaders finally get together and actually start hashing out what they want to do going forward.
A couple of things I always like to point out is that the colonists were very divided. They did not see themselves as, Virginians or as Bostonians, for example. They saw themselves as British. So not everybody is on board with this idea of revolution or the potential of splitting away, especially in the 1760s. And so that's why it was necessary to start organizing like this, because, there are estimates still that during the American Revolution, 1/3 of people were patriots, 1/3 were loyalists to the British Crown, and 1/3 really didn't choose a side and really didn't necessarily care. So, the leadership is going to be incredibly important through things like the Sons of Liberty and the Continental Congresses. And it's not just action or that leadership, it's also ideas. The Enlightenment had a lot to do with this. John Locke, straight out of the Enlightenment, his theories on natural rights and the social contract deeply influenced thinkers like Thomas Jefferson, the ideas of life, liberty. John Locke said property, and then Thomas Jefferson plagiarized and changed it just to the pursuit of happiness. But these Enlightenment principles, they fuel this revolutionary sentiment. And so by 1776, tensions are going to explode. The Declaration of Independence lays out a case for rebellion, asserting, like Thomas Jefferson plagiarized from John Locke, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, says TJ in 1776.
The Revolutionary War itself would be long and brutal. There were early losses in New York. It didn't look great for the colonial army, but there were...
The American army.
Okay,
By 1776, we are no longer colonies. We have declared ourselves as independents. We no longer call ourselves colonists. We are Americans.
A national identity forms, and we are now the American army. There are going to be some key turning points like the Battle of Saratoga, which ultimately convinces the French that maybe this is a cause that has a fighting chance. So the French will join. This French support, remember, will be critical to ultimate success. And eventually we get the Treaty of Paris in 1783, ending the revolution and granting independence.
But peace doesn't mean stability. Yes, we are independent, but our first crack at government is the Articles of Confederation, which its purpose is to not have strong centralized authority, because what did we just fight against? We just left that. So it lacked a lot of power. You couldn't collect taxes. There was no executive branch. There was no real unity. If you want to think about the former colonies, now their own states, as 13 separate little fiefdoms kind of running their own show, and no authority to raise a national militia. That's really exposed by Shays' Rebellion. After Daniel Shays almost topples Boston, The rest of the colonies are like, if that could happen in Massachusetts, it could happen here, and it puts the fear of God in them.
Right, and Daniel Shays and mostly Revolutionary War veterans that he was leading in Massachusetts in 1786 to 1787, they were upset about the economic situation, not only in Massachusetts, but the rest of the nation at that point. There was no stable currency. There were really no government funds to help anything or to do anything. So this really exposes the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. And because of that, leaders are going to realize they've got to make a change to the Articles. So in 1787, they're going to meet. It's now known as the Constitutional Convention, but the original plan for that meeting was just to revise the Articles, not to throw it away and come up with a whole new constitution, but that is what happens. And the founders really have to balance protecting personal liberty and freedoms, but also ensuring that a government has enough power to do what it needs to do to create a strong nation. So ultimately, some things are agreed upon. The Great Compromise, which allows for representation to be based on population in the House of Representatives for the larger states, and representation to be equal for the smaller states in the Senate. Also, the Three-Fifths Compromise is going to count enslaved people as 3/5 of a person to placate the southern states, and a new system of checks and balances is going to emerge because of the 3 new branches that are set up under the Constitution. But this doesn't come easily. It's written at the end of the summer of 1787, but then it has to be ratified. So 2 groups are going to form: the Federalists, who are very much in favor and supportive of the new Constitution; those who oppose the new Constitution as it was written, those were known as the Anti-Federalists. And I always hear that, these were our first 2 political parties. That is not true. Yes, the Federalists do become a political party in the 1790s, but not yet. The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists were groups supporting or opposing the new Constitution. And because there was a difference in opinion over this, it is going to lead to the addition of the Bill of Rights in order for the Constitution to be ratified and to take effect beginning in 1789.
You guys, I feel a song coming on again.
Oh, I feel a song.
So, wait a minute, ready? 3, 2, 1.
We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish this Constitution for the United States of America.
Oh my gosh, we fast forwarded. Yes, the Constitution is now the backbone of law in our country.
Wow, Garrison was too cool to sing.
I just am trying to get as much information as possible into this podcast, and whenever we break into song, it sort of distracts from that ultimate goal.
Well, okay.
You know what? Let's wrap this thing up. I think we said 15 minutes. I don't have the clock in front of me this time, but I would bet a lot of money
You're wasting time.
that we have gone over.
You're wasting time.
So here's the big picture. We've got contact between cultures that's ultimately going to shape the future of North America. Colonial diversity, it matters. We've got religious, economic, and political. The American Revolution was about Enlightenment ideals. And the U.S. Constitution emerged from the failures of the Articles and ultimately shaped the government going forward.
So, skills to focus on. Causation, what caused the revolution? Continuity and change, how did government evolve? And comparison, how did regional colonies differ?
Know these themes and you're going to be in great shape for LEQs that could be about the cause of the revolution, SAQs potentially on Enlightenment ideas, and DBQs that could be about constitutional foundations.
So as we wrap up, we would like to thank our sponsors.
Yeah, to keep it short, thanks sponsors.
Yeah, thanks sponsors.
Thanks, guys.
And thank to you for tuning into APUSH for All. Hopefully you like this review episode. It's one of our special review episodes. So if you liked it, subscribe on Spotify, Apple iTunes, YouTube. Leave us a review, whatever you got for us. And send us a message on Instagram at APUSH for All.
Yeah, we're happy students. We're happy to answer any questions you might have. Send us a message on Instagram. But until next time, keep learning from yesterday to make sense of today. How long do we think that was?
I don't know. Just
It's 57 minutes.
Hee hee.